In the winter of 1780, the American Revolution was losing in the South, not struggling, not stalling, losing. Charleston had fallen in May. More than 5,000 Continental soldiers had been handed over as prisoners, the worst single defeat the American army had suffered in the entire war. Then Camden in August, another American general, another American army destroyed in a single afternoon. 2 commanders, 2 catastrophes, 4 months apart. By the time a Quaker ironworker from Rhode Island took command of what was left of the Southern Continental Army on December 3, 1780, there were roughly 1,500 men fit to fight. They had no shoes. They had almost no ammunition. They had no unified command structure. They had no real supply line. And bearing down on them from South Carolina was the finest field army Britain had sent to the continent, 20,000 veterans of campaigns in Georgia, South Carolina, and the Caribbean, commanded by Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, one of the most aggressive and capable British generals of the war. Cornwallis had one objective: not to occupy territory, not to hold towns, to find the Southern Continental Army and destroy it completely, end it, drive the last organized American military force out of the South, and the war in this theater would be over. What happened instead is one of the strangest and most brilliant campaigns in the history of American arms. Over the next 4 months, Nathanael Greene ran. He retreated, split his army, retreated again, crossed rivers, burned boats, and refused battle over and over and over again. His officers were furious. The press called him a coward. Congress was embarrassed. And Cornwallis chased him all the way to his own destruction. To understand what Greene was doing, you have to understand who Greene was, and why almost nothing about his background suggested he should have been in command of anything. He was born in 1742 in Warwick, Rhode Island, into a Quaker family that opposed formal education, opposed military service, opposed war in all its forms. His father ran an iron foundry and expected his sons to do the same. Greene did, eventually. He took over a second family foundry in Coventry, but he also did something his faith explicitly discouraged. He read, constantly. He built a library of books on military theory, Greek and Roman classics, mathematics, and law. He was, by every documented account, entirely self-educated in the art of war. He also walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a childhood affliction that stayed with him the rest of his life. When he helped organize a local Rhode Island militia unit called the Kentish Guards in 1774, the limp disqualified him from serving as an officer. He joined as a private. Within 8 months of Lexington and Concord, the Rhode Island legislature had made him a general. The speed of that rise tells you something. Washington noticed Greene early, trusted him deeply, and kept placing him in the jobs that mattered most when the situation was worst. At Brandywine in 1777, it was Greene's division that bought enough time for Washington's retreating army to escape. At Valley Forge, when the Continental supply system was on the verge of total collapse, Washington asked Greene to take over as Quartermaster General, a role Greene accepted reluctantly and executed brilliantly, stabilizing the Army's logistics under conditions that would have broken most administrators. He served in that role for 2 years, all while continuing to lead troops in the field whenever Washington needed him. By October 1780, Washington had tried 3 other commanders in the South. Robert Howe lost Savannah, Benjamin Lincoln lost Charleston, Horatio Gates lost his army at Camden and was relieved in disgrace. Congress finally agreed to let Washington choose his own man. He chose Greene without hesitation. What Greene found when he arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina on December 3, 1780, was what the Army's own records describe as a shadow of an army. Roughly 949 Continental regulars and 533 militia fit for duty, men without shoes marching through a Carolina winter, an officer corps demoralized by 2 consecutive catastrophic defeats, no reliable supply chain, no reliable intelligence network. And surrounding them, a population that had watched the British and Loyalist forces dominate the backcountry for months and was not certain which side was going to win. Greene spent his first weeks doing something that most commanders in his position would not have done. He assessed. He gathered intelligence. He studied the rivers, roads, and terrain of the Carolinas with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that geography, not battlefield heroics, would determine the outcome of what was coming. He sent reconnaissance parties to map every major ford and crossing in the region. He wrote letters at a documented average of 8 per day, coordinating supply, intelligence, and militia contacts across hundreds of miles. And then he did something that every textbook on conventional military strategy said was insane. He divided his already tiny army in two. He kept the main body and moved southeast toward Cheraw, South Carolina. He sent roughly 1,000 men, including the best tactical subordinate in the Continental Army, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, southwest toward the British outpost at 96. Two separate forces, operating on divergent axes, separated by more than 100 miles, each one smaller than what Cornwallis could bring to bear against it individually. The conventional wisdom was that you never split a force inferior to the enemy. You concentrated. You used mass to compensate for weakness. Greene did the opposite, on purpose, for a specific reason. He wanted Cornwallis to have to choose. If Cornwallis concentrated against Greene's main body, Morgan would roam freely in the British rear, cutting supply lines and rallying Patriot militia. If Cornwallis sent a force after Morgan, it would have to divide his own army, and each fragment of a divided British force was now vulnerable to a concentrated American response. Cornwallis chose to pursue Morgan. He sent Banastre Tarleton, the most feared cavalry commander in the British Army, the man his own side called the Green Dragoon, with over 1,000 men to run Morgan down and destroy him. What happened on January 17, 1781, at a place called Cowpens is covered in full on this channel. The short version is this: Morgan turned, set a trap, and annihilated Tarleton's command. Over 800 British soldiers were killed, captured, or wounded. Tarleton himself fled the field on horseback. In roughly an hour of fighting, Cornwallis had lost a quarter of his effective strength. Cornwallis received the news of Cowpens at his camp on January 18th. Contemporary accounts record that he was so enraged that he leaned on his sword so hard it snapped under his weight. He burned his baggage train. He destroyed his supply wagons. He had his soldiers' daily rations of brandy poured into the ground so the wagons carrying them could be abandoned. He was going to move light, move fast, and run Greene and Morgan down before they could link up and escape into Virginia. One British officer, Charles O'Hara, captured the mood of the army at this moment with a phrase that has been cited by historians ever since. They had resolved, he wrote, to follow Greene's army to the end of the world. The race to the Dan had begun. The geography matters here, so picture it. Below Greene is Cornwallis. Between Greene and safety is roughly 250 miles of Carolina back country in the middle of a hard winter, swollen rivers, muddy roads churned to paste by rain, ice-cold creek crossings that had to be waded on foot. The Dan River, running along what is now the North Carolina-Virginia border, was Greene's goal. Get across the Dan, and he was in Virginia. Cornwallis had no supply base in Virginia. His men were already exhausted. He could not follow. But getting there required crossing several major rivers first, the Catawba, the Yadkin, in winter flood conditions, with Cornwallis pressing from behind and his advance cavalry, under Tarleton, probing for a gap to cut Greene off. Greene was not running blind. He had been preparing for exactly this scenario before Cowpens ever happened. He had already sent Colonel Edward Carrington ahead to inventory every boat, ferry, and river crossing between Charlotte and the Dan. He had sent the Polish engineer Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko ahead to plan defensive earthworks at the Dan River crossing points. He had prepositioned everything he needed for a crossing before the race began, because he understood that the race was coming before Cornwallis did. Morgan joined Greene at Beatty's Ford on the Catawba River on January 30th. The two generals held a council of war. The options were stark: turn and fight Cornwallis or run for Virginia. Morgan was ill, the man whose back carried the scars of 499 British lashes from the French and Indian War was suffering badly enough that he would have to leave the campaign entirely within weeks. Even so, the council's conclusion was unanimous: run. The race to the Dan began formally on January 30, 1781, and it was brutal for both sides. The British crossed the Catawba at Cowan's Ford on February 1st, overwhelming a small American rear guard that was holding the river to buy time. General William Lee Davidson, the commanding officer of the North Carolina militia covering that crossing, was killed in the engagement. His sacrifice, and those of others like him who fought delaying actions throughout the retreat, bought the main American column hours at a time, hours that translated into miles. At the Yadkin River, Greene's men crossed ahead of Cornwallis and critically commandeered every available boat on the south bank before the British arrived. Cornwallis reached the Yadkin to find a flooded river, no boats, and Greene's army safely across on the opposite bank, watching. He had to march 25 to 30 miles west to find a usable ford, costing him a day, then another day to get back onto Greene's trail. This pattern, Greene moving, destroying crossing infrastructure behind him, forcing Cornwallis onto longer alternative routes, repeated itself multiple times during the race. Every hour spent marching around a flooded ford that had no boats was an hour Cornwallis's starving, shoeless, supplyless men were not closing the gap. By early February, Greene had to make the most critical tactical decision of the entire retreat. The Dan River offered two types of crossing options. Upstream were several shallow fords, places where a sufficiently aggressive army could wade across even with the water running high. Downstream were two deepwater ferry crossings, Boyd's Ferry and Irvin's Ferry, near present-day South Boston, Virginia. The ferries required boats. But they were a shorter route for Greene's main column, which was slowed by artillery and supply wagons. Cornwallis believed Greene would have to use the upper fords. The British commander positioned himself to intercept that route. Greene had already secured the boats at Boyd's Ferry. He wasn't going anywhere near the upper fords. But he needed Cornwallis to keep believing he was, long enough for the slower main column to reach Boyd's Ferry and cross. He detached 700 men under Colonel Otho Williams, accompanied by Lieutenant Colonel Henry, Light Horse Harry, Lee's cavalry, as a fast-moving decoy force. Williams and Lee's mission: stay between Cornwallis and the upper fords, make noise, draw British attention, buy time. For 2 days, Williams and Lee ran a masterpiece of operational deception. Lee's cavalrymen and Tarleton's dragoons skirmished repeatedly, sometimes at close range. At one point, according to Lee's own later account, the two forces were within musket shot of each other during a night march. Williams pushed his men through the night of February 13th without stopping, receiving a message at dawn on February 14th that Greene's main column had crossed the Dan. When Williams read that message to his men, they cheered. Williams then turned his own column toward Boyd's Ferry and crossed as the British advance guard arrived on the south bank. The last American soldiers crossed the Dan River on the evening of February 14, 1781. As they finished, British troops appeared on the opposite bank. There were no boats. Cornwallis stood on the south side of a flooded river, looking at an entrenched American force on the opposite bank, and could not cross. The race to the Dan was over. Greene had won it without fighting a single major engagement. His army was intact, rested north of the Dan, and about to receive reinforcements and fresh supplies. Cornwallis's army was barefoot, hungry. One British officer described his men surviving on green corn and carrion, and 240 miles from their supply base at Camden. In 3.5 months, Cornwallis and Tarleton had been responsible for losing 1,513 men, almost half their effective force, without winning a major engagement against Greene. Greene spent a week north of the Dan resting his men and receiving reinforcements from Virginia militia. Then, on February 22nd, he crossed back into North Carolina. He had come back to fight on his terms, not Cornwallis's. Over the following 3 weeks, the two armies maneuvered through the North Carolina Piedmont. Greene was now the hunter. He had nearly 4,400 men, more than twice Cornwallis's effective strength, which had shrunk to roughly 1,900 exhausted regulars. He was waiting for the moment to offer battle, from a position where the ground favored his army's particular composition, a mix of reliable Continental regulars and unreliable but valuable militia who needed structured roles rather than open-field standing fights. On March 14th, the armies were within 10 miles of each other near a place called Guilford Courthouse in what is now Greensboro, North Carolina. Greene had selected his ground. Cornwallis, eager for a decisive engagement he had been chasing for months, marched his men out before breakfast on the morning of the 15th. Greene deployed in 3 lines. It was a design that historians have since recognized as a deliberate echo of Morgan's formation at Cowpens, which was itself something Greene had helped conceptualize. The first line, roughly 800 North Carolina militia, arranged along a split-rail fence at the edge of a cleared field. Their orders were not to stand and fight.